In the summer of 1346, the fields in northern France were quietly awaiting a storm that would reshape the understanding of warfare for generations. The air itself seemed to thrum with tension, not the dramatic thunder of an approaching battle, but a subtle, almost imperceptible strain that stretched across the landscapes of Picardy. Europe was a continent bristling with obligations, feuds, and alliances, a web of loyalties and enmities that could ignite into violence with the smallest spark. At the heart of this turbulence lay the ongoing struggle between the kingdoms of England and France, a conflict that would later be chronicled as the beginning of the 100 Years' War. The political climate was complex, a lattice of dynastic claims, territorial disputes, and fragile feudal allegiances. England, under the relatively young Edward III, sought to assert a claim to the French crown, a claim that carried both legal justification and strategic calculation. The French crown, under Philip VI, regarded this as a direct affront, a challenge to both authority and honor. But beyond the legalistic claims, there existed a broader context of pressure. French territory was vast, and maintaining control over demanded both disciplined armies and a constant projection of power. English ambitions, modest in numbers yet precise in execution, threatened this projection not just politically, but militarily. By the spring of that year, Edward III had orchestrated an invasion with measured prudence. Unlike many of the impulsive campaigns chronicled in earlier decades, this was a calculated maneuver. He marshaled a force that, while smaller than the massive levies the French could muster, relied upon cohesion, discipline, and most crucially, the English longbow, a weapon that could extend the reach of his relatively small army beyond traditional limits. This was no sudden strike. Months of preparation, careful reconnaissance, and logistical planning preceded the crossing of the English Channel. Every decision, from the selection of landing sites in Normandy to the timing of marches inland, was informed by both strategic necessity and an acute understanding of French military culture. The French, meanwhile, relied upon conventions of medieval warfare that had been cemented over centuries. Knights and heavy cavalry formed the backbone of their offensive and defensive doctrine. Philip VI's army was numerically superior, drawing from the feudal levies of the north and the banners of his vassals. The knights themselves were trained to dominate open terrain, to use shock and weight as the decisive instruments of combat. Their faith in armor, lances, and mounted discipline was near absolute, reflecting both the societal valorization of the mounted warrior and the tactical orthodoxy of the time. As Edward's forces moved through northern France, the strategic situation crystallized around a single, critical vulnerability: the French need to engage swiftly and decisively. Philip understood that allowing the English to penetrate deeper into his territories risked the erosion of both authority and morale. But there was also caution. The French command was aware, in vague terms, of the English archers' reputation. Accounts of previous campaigns hinted at the devastating range and volume of their fire. Yet, the French overestimated the effectiveness of their own formations and the psychological superiority of heavily armored knights. There was a subtle, almost imperceptible misalignment between expectation and reality, a misalignment that would prove catastrophic. Over the weeks leading to the engagement at Crécy, both sides navigated a landscape of shifting advantage. Edward's army moved deliberately, using terrain, weather, and logistical efficiency to mitigate the disparity in numbers. Roads and rivers dictated the pace of marches, while reconnaissance skirmishes probed French positions, revealing both intent and weakness. Edward's strategy reflected a synthesis of defensive caution and opportunistic offense. Avoid direct confrontation until conditions favor the English, disrupt French supply lines, and prepare positions where his archers could dominate. The psychological dimensions of this campaign cannot be overstated. English soldiers, many of them footmen and archers drawn from the yeomanry, carried a deep understanding of their own tactical utility. They were aware that against knights in full armor, conventional engagement meant likely annihilation. Their training emphasized formation discipline, coordinated volleys, and maintaining morale under sustained pressure. For the French, the psychology was almost inverted. Confidence in martial superiority, tempered by a bureaucratic need to demonstrate resolve. The pressure to act swiftly, compounded by the expectations of feudal lords eager for personal glory, created a climate ripe for impulsive decisions. Edward's use of terrain exemplified the subtle mastery of defensive preparation. The English positioned themselves on a gentle rise, with hedgerows, ditches, and plowed fields forming natural obstacles that would slow any mounted charge. Archers were arrayed in carefully spaced lines, stakes driven into ground to disrupt cavalry momentum, creating a zone where the French numerical advantage could not be simply brought to bear. These arrangements were not visible from a distance, and their full tactical effect would only reveal itself in the heat of combat. Meanwhile, Philip's forces gathered with confidence, perhaps even a degree of arrogance. The French knights were seasoned, battle-hardened, and accustomed to triumph through frontal assault. Their numbers, estimated at over 30,000, dwarfing Edward's roughly 6,000 English troops, provided a psychological cushion, a sense that sheer mass could overwhelm any defense. But even as the French advanced, there were fissures in command cohesion. Coordination among the contingents was uneven, some lords eager to press forward, others cautious and hesitant. These variances would magnify the impact of unforeseen obstacles on the battlefield. The weeks and months preceding Crécy reveal a tension between methodical strategy and traditional expectation. Edward's careful buildup contrasted sharply with the French reliance on conventional doctrine. Both sides operated under assumptions shaped by experience. Yet the collision of these assumptions would produce outcomes that neither fully anticipated. The English understood that victory depended not merely on the bravery of individual soldiers, but on the orchestration of forces in time and space. The French, by contrast, relied upon the intrinsic efficacy of mounted shock, trusting that weight and momentum would dictate results. Even the surrounding environment played a critical role in shaping strategy. Late summer in northern France brought weather that was capricious, and the rolling plains of Picardy, interspersed with small villages, hedgerows, and gentle inclines, presented both obstacles and opportunities. Muddy tracks could slow cavalry, while open fields could facilitate rapid advances. The English recognized these subtleties. Positioning was chosen to maximize their archers' effectiveness, while constraining the French ability to maneuver. Each ridge, each furrowed field, became a deliberate instrument of strategy, turning geography into an ally in a contest defined by numbers, skill, and morale. And so, as the armies approached one another across the countryside, there was a palpable tension, not the chaos of immediate combat, but a simmering awareness that decisions made in the coming hours could reverberate far beyond this field. Edward's troops, steady and disciplined, prepared under the quiet authority of a king who understood both his limitations and his advantages. The French knights, confident yet unevenly coordinated, advanced under the expectation of glory, anticipating a confrontation that would cement their superiority. In these moments, the battlefield became a crucible for leadership, psychology, and tactical foresight. Every choice, where to march, when to rest, how to array forces, carried disproportionate consequences. Edward's calm, deliberate preparation would contrast with the French insistence on momentum and direct action. This divergence in approach set the stage for a confrontation in which the familiar rules of medieval warfare would be challenged, and where the ingenuity of a smaller, well-prepared force would meet the raw strength of a larger, conventionally confident army. The strategic build-up to Crécy was, in essence, a collision of preparation and expectation. Edward's calculations emphasized control, discipline, and exploiting emerging vulnerabilities. Philip's approach relied upon numerical superiority, traditional valor, and the shock effect of mounted knights. The tension between these perspectives, calculated foresight versus assumed dominance, would define the early hours of the battle and foreshadow the extraordinary outcome that would echo through history. As the English encampment settled into position on that summer's eve, archers testing the tension of their longbows, infantry sharpening stakes, and leaders walking lines to assess readiness, the future seemed uncertain, yet quietly determined by deliberate preparation. Across the fields, the French hosts arranged themselves with similar diligence, unaware that the very assumptions that guided their approach would soon collide with the tactical innovations of the English. By the time dawn approached over the fields near the village of Crécy-en-Ponthieu, two forces, shaped by differing doctrines, psychological pressures, and political imperatives, stood on the cusp of a confrontation that would not only decide the day, but signal a transformation in the art of war itself. And so, with the summer mist still clinging to ground, the stage was set for a battle where discipline, terrain, and the silent pull of tension would rewrite the expectations of medieval combat. Dawn broke over the gentle slopes of Crécy, revealing a countryside deceptively calm. Its patchwork of plowed fields and hedgerows belied the tens of thousands of men poised for conflict. Edward III's army, though outnumbered 5-1, held a position of subtle advantage. The English had taken up a line along a gentle rise, with their flanks anchored by woods and streams, natural boundaries that would channel any French advance into predictable corridors. Stakes, sharpened and firmly driven into the earth, stood as silent sentinels before the lines of archers, a simple yet insidious innovation against mounted assault. The English forces were composed primarily of longbowmen, trained over years to draw with both strength and precision. They were supported by men-at-arms, disciplined infantry capable of resisting cavalry and protecting the archers. Foot soldiers dug ditches and reinforced positions, working quietly, methodically, understanding the role each would play in the battle to come. Morale, though tested by the long campaign through hostile territory, remained remarkably stable, anchored by the clarity of purpose and the presence of their king, whose calm assessment of terrain and enemy disposition imbued his men with quiet confidence. Across the fields, the French army gleamed in the morning sun. Heavy armor reflected light off polished steel, and the banners of northern fiefs fluttered in a gentle breeze. Philip VI and his commanders, proud of their numerical superiority and the centuries of cavalry tradition, took their positions with the expectation that mass and momentum would decide the encounter. The army was structured for shock, mounted knights at the forefront, supported by crossbowmen, infantry, and a small contingent of mercenary specialists. Coordination among these contingents, however, was inherently challenging. Feudal hierarchies required each lord to assert authority over his own contingent, producing inevitable discrepancies in timing and cohesion. The psychological climate on both sides was a critical factor. For the English, tension was focused, almost ritualized. Every archer knew the order of volley, every infantryman the depth of line to maintain. Fear, if present, was disciplined and channeled through collective training. For the French knights, confidence was intertwined with pride. Heavy armor promised protection, and the conventions of combat reinforced the belief that mounted knights could decisively crush opposition. Yet there existed a subtle uncertainty. Reconnaissance had indicated obstacles, uneven ground, and an enemy prepared in defensive positions. The implications were known, if not fully appreciated. The knights' faith in their own invulnerability was a double-edged sword. Edward's deployment reflected both realism and ingenuity. The archers were arrayed in multiple lines, each staggered slightly, allowing overlapping field to fire. The stakes in front of the foremost line were intended to break cavalry charge momentum, turning the battlefield into a measured killing zone. Behind the archers, men-at-arms formed compact blocks, ready to respond to any penetration or disorder. The English understood the limitations of their own numbers and sought to convert those limitations into strategic leverage, deny the French mobility, maximize the effectiveness of each arrow, and force engagement on terms favorable to their composition. Philip VI's approach, by contrast, emphasized directness. The French knights were to advance in successive waves, their heavy lances aimed at breaking the English line. Crossbowmen and infantry were tasked with support, though their positioning often lagged behind the momentum of mounted assault. The assumption was that the first wave, reinforced as needed, would overwhelm resistance through shock, fear, and brute force. Yet even as plans were made, there was a growing tension between the pressure to act decisively and the practical constraints imposed by terrain and coordination. Small ditches, hedgerows, and the slight rise of English position would complicate movement. But these were not fully accounted for in initial deliberations. The opening engagement began with probing movements. French knights advanced toward the English positions, testing defenses, while archers skirmished at range. Arrows were loose in both directions, yet the longbowmen's disciplined volleys began to shape the battle environment. From a distance, the English archers released a steady rhythm of fire, hundreds of shafts in rapid succession, each designed to disrupt formation and sap morale. Horses balked at the approaching stakes and the unrelenting hail of arrows. Knights, weighed down by armor, struggled to maintain cohesion as gaps opened within their ranks. The French numerical advantage, though formidable in theory, was blunted by the geography and the concentrated fire. Command decisions during this period were decisive yet constrained. Edward III monitored the advance, adjusting archer lines and shifting men-at-arms to reinforce threatened sectors. Each movement was measured, designed to maintain formation integrity while exploiting the slowing momentum of the French. Philip VI, observing the stalling of his initial charge, faced an acute leadership dilemma: press the attack and risk disorganized collisions, or pause and reorganize, conceding initiative to the English. Pressure from subordinate lords eager for glory amplified the urgency, pushing the French toward repeated frontal assaults without full reconnaissance or tactical adaptation. As the morning progressed, successive French charges collided with the prepared English positions. Arrows thudded into shields, armor, and horses with unnerving regularity. Cavalry momentum faltered on uneven terrain and against the stakes. The English maintained composure, allowing volleys to create disruption, sowing confusion, and exploiting the natural bottleneck created by the land itself. Individual bravery could not compensate for the systemic challenges imposed by both English preparation and environmental constraints. The battle's psychological intensity escalated. French knights, expecting unimpeded charges, confronted the reality of a disciplined enemy who refused to break under initial impact. Horses were killed or panicked. Formations fragmented, and the initial wave began to bleed cohesion. Leaders struggled to assert control. The chain of command strained under the weight of misalignment between expectation and reality. On the English side, each arrow that found its mark reinforced confidence, creating a quiet, accumulative psychological edge. The tension between anticipation and outcome grew palpable. The French expected a swift, decisive engagement, while the English methodically turned expectation into attrition. As midday approached, weather and terrain continued to exert subtle influence. Light winds carried arrows farther. Ditches slowed cavalry, and the slight rise of the English position allowed clear fields of vision for targeting advancing troops. Even minor variations, mud under hooves, hedgerows impeding lateral movement, were magnified under the concentrated pressure of combat. Leadership decisions became increasingly crucial. Timing, spacing, and coordination dictated survival. Every knight pressing forward into the kill zone faced a combination of physical obstacles, lethal archery, and the disorienting effects of sustained fire. By the afternoon, it was evident that conventional doctrine had faltered against disciplined preparation and innovative use of terrain and weaponry. French assaults continued, relentless yet increasingly costly, with knights falling at intervals, horses collapsing under volleys, and morale fraying under the combined strain of expectation, unmet, and visible losses mounting. Commanders attempted to reorder lines and coordinate further attacks, but the terrain, archery, and sheer wave attrition constrained options. Each decision carried immediate consequences. Advance too cautiously and initiative is lost. Press too aggressively and units are shattered. The English, under Edward's quiet supervision, maintained their cohesion. Archers rotated lines, men-at-arms reinforced weak points, and the rhythm of the battlefield, volley, advance, counter, was controlled with precision. The psychological tension, though severe, was channeled into disciplined action. Soldiers internalized the necessity of restraint and the importance of exploiting each French misstep. Victory was being methodically carved out through anticipation, preparation, and controlled execution rather than heroic single acts. As the sun climbed higher, it became increasingly clear that the French numerical superiority was insufficient to secure success. Each charge, though massive in potential impact, was funneled into zones preordained by the English positioning. Stakes, arrows, and terrain combined to transform advantage into vulnerability. Leadership dilemmas intensified. Subordinate lords, witnessing repeated failure and growing casualties, pressed for action even as coherence declined. French command found itself negotiating between momentum, pride, and emerging chaos, a struggle that would define the eventual outcome. By late afternoon, the opening and middle phases of the engagement had demonstrated a profound shift in the mechanics of warfare. The English longbow, disciplined formations, and tactical preparation had neutralized the assumed advantages of heavy cavalry. Individual bravery, traditional doctrine, and sheer numbers could not substitute for coordination under fire, adaptability to terrain, or psychological resilience. What had begun as a conventional confrontation had become a study in attrition, decision-making under pressure, and the quiet power of preparation. By late afternoon, the battlefield at Crécy had become a tableau of relentless tension, where every charge, volley, and repositioning carried amplified consequence. The French knights, despite their heavy armor and pride, were now moving under the crushing weight of repeated failure. Horses had become scarce, broken, or panicked. Lines of advance were disrupted by ditches, hedgerows, and the stakes that had been methodically planted by English foot soldiers. The initial confidence that had driven Philip VI's army into motion had begun to erode, replaced by frustration, confusion, and the stark realization that numerical superiority alone could not secure victory. Edward III, observing the unfolding struggle, made the critical choice to consolidate rather than overextend. Reinforcements were not pressed into fray unnecessarily. Archers rotated positions to maintain fresh volleys, while men-at-arms protected weak points and prepared to exploit any openings. Edward understood the psychological momentum shifting toward his forces. Each failed charge, each fallen knight, each panicked horse reinforced perception among the French that success was slipping beyond reach. This was not mere chance. It was a result of meticulous preparation, anticipation of enemy behavior, and disciplined execution under sustained pressure. The turning point came as a culmination of compounding factors: exhaustion among the French, terrain-induced bottlenecks, and the unrelenting efficacy of the longbow. The first wave of knights, once cohesive and confident, had become fragmented. Subsequent waves faced the dual challenge of broken terrain and the concentrated fire of well-positioned archers. Each successive charge, instead of overwhelming the English, exposed them to lethal and demoralizing attrition. Horses collapsed under arrow volleys. Knights were unhorsed or killed outright, and gaps within formations grew. Commanders on the French side struggled to maintain coherence. Miscommunication and hesitation became increasingly fatal. Philip VI faced an agonizing dilemma: continue pressing forward, risking catastrophic loss and potential rout, or withdraw and concede the battlefield while maintaining some semblance of honor. Yet feudal culture and the expectations of his vassals weighed heavily. Pride, obligation, and the traditional valuation of mounted bravery compelled repeated assaults. This insistence on action, despite deteriorating circumstances, magnified disorder and amplified casualties. In contrast, Edward's patience transformed each French misstep into an advantage, reinforcing English control and consolidating tactical superiority. By mid-afternoon, the psychological collapse among French forces was unmistakable. Knights who had survived initial charges found themselves confronting an enemy that refused to break, whose concentrated, disciplined volley systematically reduced both momentum and morale. Panic subtly spread, not as sudden hysteria, but as a quiet erosion of confidence within ranks. Commanders hesitated, lords argued, and coordination faltered. The battlefield, once dominated by the promise of French shock, had been transformed into an environment where initiative had shifted irreversibly to the English. The final phase of the engagement saw the collapse of French tactical cohesion. Repeated assaults, now lacking both surprise and organization, collided with prepared defenses. Horses were cut down, knights fell into ditches or were unseated by relentless arrow fire, and the orderly fronts dissolved into fragmented groups vulnerable to concentrated countermeasures. English men-at-arms advanced selectively, exploiting gaps while committing to reckless engagement, while archers maintained lethal pressure. By the close of day, the French army, though numerically superior, had suffered disproportionate casualties, with entire contingents rendered combat ineffective. The aftermath of Crécy was stark and historically significant. French prestige, once unquestioned on the battlefield, had been severely undermined. The principles of mounted shock and conventional medieval warfare were revealed to be vulnerable to disciplined foot soldiers wielding well-prepared long-range weapons. Edward III, through preparation, tactical innovation, and calm leadership, had demonstrated that numerical superiority alone could be neutralized by foresight, cohesion, and understanding of both terrain and enemy psychology. The victory reshaped perceptions of military power and foreshadowed the evolution of battlefield tactics across Europe. Beyond immediate tactical success, the battle had profound implications for the soldiers themselves. English archers, foot soldiers, and men-at-arms returned from the field with reinforced understanding of their own strategic value. French knights, many of whom perished or were captured, confronted a new reality: armor, and training, while formidable, were no longer sufficient guarantees of battlefield dominance. The psychological impact of sustained, disciplined longbow fire, combined with prepared defensive positions, introduced a paradigm shift in military thinking. Strategically, Crécy accelerated the recognition of combined arms tactics and utility of ranged weaponry in medieval warfare. The English army, relatively small but tightly organized, had inflicted disproportionate damage on a much larger force, demonstrating that battlefield effectiveness depended as much on planning, positioning, and adaptability as on raw numbers or personal valor. The French experience underscored the risks of over-reliance on tradition, illustrating how pride, assumption, and misaligned command structures could catalyze catastrophic outcomes under sustained pressure. In the months following Crécy, the consequences rippled across the political and military landscape. Philip VI's authority was shaken, and questions arose regarding feudal loyalty, strategic judgment, and the capacity of mounted aristocracy to dominate in the face of disciplined infantry and archery. Edward III's reputation, by contrast, was enhanced not merely through victory, but through the demonstration of calculated leadership under pressure. Subsequent campaigns and military innovations would continue to build upon the lessons first revealed in the fields near Crécy: the integration of range firepower, terrain exploitation, and cohesion under stress. In retrospect, Crécy represents more than a battlefield triumph. It is a study in the interplay of leadership, psychology, and tactical innovation. It illustrates how deliberate preparation, anticipation of enemy behavior, and disciplined execution can neutralize seemingly insurmountable odds. The battle revealed the vulnerabilities inherent in traditional doctrine and highlighted the emerging prominence of adaptability, cohesion, and strategic patience. Each arrow, each disciplined formation, each calculated decision combined to create a cascade of consequences that reshaped the medieval understanding of warfare. Ultimately, the humiliation of 30,000 French knights by 6,000 English archers was not merely a tale of weaponry or numbers. It was a demonstration of the quiet power of foresight, the discipline of preparation, and the subtle art of controlling both environment and expectation. Crécy would endure as a lesson in how precision, strategy, and psychological insight could transform battlefield dynamics, foreshadowing the gradual decline of armored shock dominance and the rise of combined arms tactics that would define later centuries. The fields where men clashed under the summer sun remain etched in history, not simply for the blood spilled, but for the clarity with which the battle revealed the profound consequences of leadership, preparation, and disciplined execution under pressure.